1981, a gloomy late autumn day in the California sky. The private plane carrying the four young men of the band Crimson Fire Line, Zane Hayes, Trent Maddox, Derek Clean, and Ricky Morneau, disappeared from radar near the coast. Not a trace, not a single report, just an endless void containing a terrifying mystery. The TV station lit up. Four young artists disappeared without a word of goodbye. Zane's mother, Helen Hayes, was stunned when she heard the news, telling her that this was not a trivial event. She always believed that her son was on a journey to find his dream and might have met with an accident. That shock froze time, lasting for 19 years. When darkness fell over Crescent Harbor, where Helen lived alone, everything was quiet as if it did not exist except for an old photo of Zane smiling on stage. The days after the incident turned Helen from a brilliant mother into a ghost living in seclusion. Today, the phone rang, her heart immediately tightened. "Mrs. Hayes?" A cold male voice echoed from the other end of the line. "We just pulled from the bottom of the sea. A private plane that matches the description. Stop lying to me," she resolutely hung up. All hope was buried deep. She could not bear the false pain anymore. Recognition, she realized. The pain could not be erased, but the words were real. FBI agent Dana Trout called back, her voice kind. "We need you at the Portsmouth base." Helen wore a light navy blue shirt. Her eyes were hollow and haggard. Her steps were automatic like a living corpse. On the way to the base, she met other mothers, Patricia Maddox, Trent's mother, Ms. Klein's, Derek's aunt. They were also in a state of helplessness, and for the first time in years, Helen felt she was not alone. A gentle sense of empathy spread. Their shared pain connected them, even though each of them had suffered their own separate traumas. When they reached the base, the plane appeared like a deep-sea mummy, covered in moss but still intact. They kept their distance. Helen stood in front of the autopsy room door, her heart pounding as if someone had just struck two iron balls, her body trembling as she watched the body bags being opened one by one. The first thing they saw: Trent's impressive red leopard skin outfit, a hallmark of his youth. The sad opening theme repeated itself, evidence never lies. Patricia screamed in pain, holding her son's portrait, shaking in the cold air. The group looked at each other, sobbing. But when bags 3 and 4 were identified as two men in suits, outsiders, possibly record label representatives or men in charge of the group's finances, they realized. The story was more than just the plane crash. The truth is shocking. There are signs of gunfire. The victims were shot from the front. A big shock. This is not a crisis due to technical problems, but an organized murder plot. "This is a homicide?" Agent Trout's voice trembles slightly. In that chaotic moment, a faint light flashes. Zane and Ricky may not be on the ship, and they are still alive. The intelligence is like a whisper of help amid the wreckage. "We have the ability to save them. Although there is no evidence, the investigation will be expanded." Those days, the waves brought not only icy silence, but also new hope. This has turned the story from shock to recognition, the realization. Her child is not only on the border between life and death. She and the other mothers need to wake up, face it. Immediately after that, Mrs. Helen is taken to a small, private room where the mothers sit and talk, sharing their own stories. The pale yellow light was warmer than the cold light on the plane. In that space, she understood. The presence of those who had lost like her was a comfort, albeit fragile. Each story. The searches, the failed reports, the shattered dreams made Helen close her eyes, tears welling up. A moment of deep empathy. They both fell into the quagmire of pain, but had each other to live on. They would no longer be lost alone in memories. The end of part 1 is reflection. Reflection. The image of Helen returning home after a morning at the base, entering the small, quiet house, the four walls reminding her of the time when she and Zane used to listen to music talk. But now there is only silence. She turned on the Usenet forum where 5 years ago she wrote poems, called her son's name with fragile hope. The lively message tonight echoed, plane recovered, 2 bodies confirmed. Maybe others are still missing. Protect your heart. The message was short but touched the bottom of her heart. This was not a dream, it was real now, and Helen suddenly understood. She could not deny the pain, but she could not deny the belief either. Hope, a faint hope that was kindled. If Zane was not dead, then she still had a chance to see her son again. And action, she decided. To leave the silent darkness, to join the investigation, there was no better miracle than sitting still and waiting for something to happen. Her life would not be the same as before. She would fight for her son, for the truth. Helen returned from Portsmouth with her mind as turbulent as the ocean that had just risen above the wreckage of the plane that had gone missing 19 years earlier. She couldn't remember the roads she'd driven down, only the yellow light streaming through the windows, revealing the deep lines on her face. When she got home, she sat motionless in the middle of the living room, facing a picture of Zane smiling, holding up his familiar electric guitar. But tonight, the smile didn't hurt her like it usually did. It just made her even more silent, not because she'd accepted the truth, but because something in her heart was moving. The next morning, she returned to the base. No one asked her to, but she needed to be there. When she entered the waiting room where the mothers had gathered, Helen saw Patricia whispering to Agent Trout, clutching a silver necklace with a picture of her son. In the corner, Derek's aunt, Mrs. Klein's, was sorting through the thick stack of photocopies she had been secretly carrying around for 10 years. They saw Helen and nodded slightly, no greetings needed, because her eyes said it all. "I am like you. I have lived with that trauma too." Inside the evidence room, the little things began to tell the big story. A tour poster was smeared with seawater, a handwritten note that contained only a few lines. "Z, if anything happens, protect that demo." The rest was rotten. Helen bowed her head, trying to hear her heartbeat over the sound of the pages turning and the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. And then the technician presented a new discovery. In a secret compartment beneath the luggage compartment, they had found a sealed metal box. Inside were tapes, unreleased demos, and a leather notebook. At this point, the personal pain gradually became the story of a generation robbed of its voice. The demo, called Black Sequence, never featured on any official track list, was a strange mix of electronic rock and a whisper in French. When played back, it sounded distorted and creepy, but Zane's voice was still recognizable in the background, calling out, "We are not safe," like a warning. Agent Trout began digging into the records of Stonehook Records, Crimson Fireline's former label. They discovered that the two men in suits in the wreckage were senior staff, who had been accused of forcing young artists into unfair contracts. But the lawsuit was dismissed in 1980. The evidence began to pile up. This was no longer an accident. This was a deliberate assassination. But why leave the bodies in the plane and let them fall to the bottom of the ocean? One of the mothers whispered. They wanted to bury everything quietly. That evening, Helen, Patricia, and Mrs. Klein sat together in a guest house near the base. They were no longer grieving mothers sitting apart. They were allies. All three shared their premonitions that their children were alive, dreams, songs they overheard, sightings of their children's names on old record covers. Helen told them how years ago someone had sent her a torn envelope with only the words, "Still breathing," written on it, but the police had ruled it a hoax. Now she wondered, could it be that was a message from Zane? A moment later, Agent Trout's phone rang. He entered, his face tense. "We have reason to believe that the two missing members of the group landed on the Baja California coast just hours after the plane crashed. There are footprints and a ring that matches the photos of Zane wearing in concerts." No one spoke. The feeling spread like fire under ice. Could it be they had actually survived? And where had they gone? Why hadn't they come back? That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She opened the old diary, each line of a mother's feelings of waiting now bursting in her mind. In the dim yellow light, she added a new line. "If you're alive, let me know. I won't give up." And the next morning, she went to Agent Trout, put her hands on the table, and said, "I don't just want to be a witness. I want to be part of the investigation. I know my son better than anyone. If there's a chance to find him, I'll do anything." In the days that followed, the Portsmouth base was no longer a cold checkpoint, but a center of hearts that never gave up. Helen and the two remaining mothers were allowed to join the special investigation team with Agent Trout. Here, they were no longer painful witnesses, but living memories, the only ones who knew every detail of the habits, singing voices, moles, rings, or signatures of the boys from back then. In the investigation room, Helen pointed to the satellite map overlaid on the Baja California coast, where two footprints had been recorded on the sand in 1981. If Zane had fallen here, he would have found his way to the nearest place with people or fresh water. They began to trace possible routes according to the logic of survival. Every calculation was no longer just technical, but carried the warmth of a mother who had never given up. Agent Trout opened a file that had been shelved for nearly 2 decades, the file on a strange character named Miguel Rojas, who reported seeing 2 young, injured white men lost in the small fishing town of San Vicente in 1981. The report had been dismissed at the time because there was no data to back it up. But Helen, upon hearing the name of the town, perked up. Zane mentioned it in a song that was never released about a place where the light was dim and the sea was saltier than tears. They checked the rough demo. The lyrics were real. It was no longer a coincidence. For the first time, the facts began to match. The group flew to Baja California. The fishing village of San Vicente now had just over 100 people. Red dirt roads, loose wooden doors, barking dogs, and a salty sea breeze. As Helen stepped out of the car, something in the air made her heart clench. They met Miguel, now in his 70s, living in an old wooden house near the sea. When Helen showed him a photo of Zane in 1980, Miguel nodded slowly. He had the eyes of a beacon, scared but not backing down. He was with another boy who looked like he had a bad leg. I let them spend 2 nights in an old fishing hut, then they disappeared. I thought they were migrants. That made everyone gasp. Miguel pulled out a faded scarf from a wooden drawer. He left this. I kept it as a talisman. Helen took it, her lips trembling. It was the scarf Zane wore in his last music video. The smell of rotten wood, salt, and ash from the past mixed together into an unnamed emotion. Agent Trout contacted the Migrant Protection Center in Mexico. Suddenly, an unsolved file from 1982 appeared. J.H. and D.L., 2 anonymous Americans who had been recorded asking for help and then disappearing overnight. The photos were blurry, but the skeleton and the way they walked made Helen choke up. It was him, I know. Trout nodded. If they were alive, they would have hidden themselves for 2 decades. The question is, why? That night in San Vicente, as the cold wind blew over the cliffs, Helen sat alone on the beach. For the first time in years, she felt something other than sadness, but awakening. No more passive waiting, no more silent crying. She was following her son's footsteps with her own motherly heart. She remembered what Zane had written in a letter. If one day I disappear, don't look for me in the light, look for me in the dark, where I can sing most truly. She whispered, I'm here, Zane. The next day, the investigation team decided to return to the United States, bringing with them new evidence to ask permission to reopen the case as missing and alive after attempted murder. Helen, Patricia, and Mrs. Klein's were no longer the wandering mothers of the past. They were living witnesses, and also the ones who inspired the fight for justice. On the plane back, Helen held the scarf in her hand, her eyes fixed on the window. The California sky appeared in the distance, but this time it was no longer the sky that held the pain. It was the sky that opened to the future. Washington, 2002. The case was officially reopened under the title of Suspected Disappearances and Signs of Post-Event Activity. The FBI set up a special investigation team, Project Ember, a symbol of the unquenchable fire buried deep in the ashes. Helen became the first civilian collaborator ever granted access to the National Music Archive, where all the unreleased DMOS, tour logs, and record label contracts were kept. From there, the truth began to emerge. Crimson Fireline drummer Ricky had sent an anonymous email warning that the group was being forced to sign an exploitative contract, threatening to leave if they didn't agree. Sent to an independent attorney in September 1981. A month later, they were missing. Strangely, the email was never opened due to a formatting error. Now, when opened, the last line appeared. If we don't come back, the truth is being buried with the sky. Trout works with Interpol to track down a small studio in La Paz, Mexico, where in 1982, 2 anonymous American musicians had rented a room to record a solo project under the pseudonym Dune South. The recordings are recovered from old cassette tapes, a beautiful husky voice tinged with despair, and a crisp Ricky-like drum beat. Helen listens to the demo in a soundproofed room, tears streaming down her face. It's Zane. There's no mistaking it. He's alive. Project Ember launches a new campaign, fingerprinting the recording, analyzing DNA on scarves, and posting snippets online as anonymous songs from a missing artist. The song goes viral. Millions of people listen, including one anonymous user who comments, he doesn't want to be found. Trout immediately traces the IP, which leads to a remote farm in Oregon, home to a reclusive, technology-free community of artists. Once again, Helen set off. A wooden house in the pine forest, a slanted tiled roof, and a flickering oil lamp. When Helen arrived, a man in his mid-40s with long hair and a goatee stepped out. His eyes stopped on her as if he had seen a ghost. No one spoke for 3 minutes, then he spoke softly. Mom, how did you know I was here? Helen did not answer. She walked over and touched his cheek. Cold, thin, but real. Not a dream, she only said, because I never stopped looking for you. Zane invited her in. In a room covered with cassette tapes, poetry books, handwritten music sheets, his life appeared. After the accident, Ricky was seriously injured. They were rescued by villagers. But when he discovered that the accident was a murder plot, possibly due to financial manipulation by the record company, Zane decided to disappear to save his life and not let anyone exploit his music again. Ricky died of a foot infection a year later. Zane carried his ashes everywhere, recording a song for his friend, "My Fireline Ends Here." He chose to live as if he didn't exist. Helen took her son's hand, "But I can't run forever." Zane smiled, his eyes weary. "I know, but the world out there kills the things I love." Helen didn't convince him to come back. She understood, but she left one thing behind: a copy of the investigation file, where Zane's name had been officially removed from the list of fatalities. "You're not dead anymore, Zane. Live, the way you want." On the way back, Helen didn't take her son with her. She took the demo of Dune South in her bag. She sent it to Patricia and Klein's. They listened to it in tears. A part of the truth was returned. A part of her memory was named. She was no longer lost, but had something new: forgiveness for the past, for herself. 2 months later, the song was released under Zane's real name, with his consent, but no one knew where he was. The song climbed to the top of the Billboard charts as a living symbol of love, loss, and music. And every time someone asked Helen, "Are you still looking for your son?" she just smiled. "I found him in the song."